Greetings from India. My name is Snigdha Basu, and I will be moderating today's session. I'm associated with the current project of telling your story as an assistant, and I'm also a postgraduate student of English literature. I welcome you to the stories of food and drinks, shaping cultural identity and ideology curated under TMYS Review September 2022 in collaboration with the York Center for Asian Research, York University, and Reader Marion. We are also calling for submissions of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists, Dr. James Mchugh and Erica Wald, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic for today's discussion is cultural differences in drinks across religion, caste, and communities under the theme Drinks in Culture and Culture of Drinks. All our panelists are experts in the area with many years of professional experience. Before we begin, I would like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for the session is Dr. James. He studies the history and religions of early India. He completed his PhD at Harvard University in 2008 and is now professor at the University of Southern California. His first book, Sandalwood and Carrion, explored the meanings of odors, perfumes, and aromatics in India. His latest book, An Unholy Brew, Alcohol in Indian History and Religions, is a study of alcohol, drinking, and abstinence in pre-modern South Asia. Delighted to have you with us, sir, today. Thank you for joining us. Our second speaker for the session is Dr. Erica Wald. Dr. Wald is a senior lecturer in modern history at Goldsmiths, University of London. Her current research explores the role of leisure in the construction and understanding of empire in India. She received her PhD in history from University of Cambridge and her MSc in politics of empire and post-imperialism from London Schools of Economics. She co-edits the British Journal of Military History. She is interested in the interrelationship between the body and empire and a broader cultural history of alcohol. Honored to have you with us, ma'am. Thank you for joining us today. We now open the forum for discussion. I would like to request Dr. James to share his insights on today's topic of discussion. So you're muted.
Thank you, and thank you for everyone being here and for that kind of introduction. So I'm just going to sort of make a few comments, and we'll sort of move into the sort of Q&A. I guess how I ended up talking at this is, like I said, this book on the history of alcohol, and a few other substances as well in pre-modern India. And although today the sort of topic is sort of community, sort of social, sort of different groups of people, drinking, not drinking, drinking different things. I think one thing that really emerged that's kind of important as well is, when I was doing this book, is just how many different types of drinks people did make and how that changed over time. And this is just pretty meager textual evidence, really. So if you think like what you've got in surviving Sanskrit texts, as opposed to what was actually going on the ground, what people were making is, there's probably a lot more going on than we can ever know about from our surviving evidence. And so there was a lot of things, and this changed over time as well, like, different and suggestions, and this is probably how it was. Different things were associated with different regions. So if you think you had drinks made from grains, from rice, from barley, from wheat, and things like that, and you also had palm toddy, you had grape wine, imported grape wine often, which would have been very prestigious. If you think like a big jar of wine coming from sort of somewhere near Iran, being shipped over this big, heavy clay object full of heavy liquid. By the time it kind of got somewhere in India, that would have been a lot more expensive than, say, something made from local sugarcane juice. So there'd been these sort of economic differences. And then another thing to bear in mind as well is that they didn't, people didn't really, and this kind of applied in places in the world as well, that there wasn't a concept of alcohol. in all these drinks. So it's not, they weren't necessarily, they were seen as affecting you, sort of making you drunk, making you, feel weird, act weird. But it wasn't necessarily because they all contained the same substance, namely alcohol, which is how we think of them. So in terms of classifying them and making laws about them, they were often seen as more different than we think of the drinks nowadays. A bit like we think of drugs as kind of different, like it's a completely different thing. Like this was a different drug. It was like, oh well, the thing made from grains, the thing that messes with your head, the drink messes with your head made from grains is completely different from the one made from, say, sugarcane. They sort of really did think of them as very, very different substances. And this does crop up in the legal literature. So you've got this like huge variety of drinks going on. And so when it comes to different sort of social groups having different relations with it, that is an important part of the picture. So, I mean, you've got to think, if you take the communities that did drink, like let's set aside the ones that didn't drink, but communities that did drink, you'd have these economic differences, presumably. We have a little bit of evidence from this. So you do have sort of very glowing references to this sort of imported, no doubt imported from much of the region, sort of Afghan wine, like this Carpishayana wine, which was clearly prestigious, and then you'll have references to sort of like not quite a bar, but kind of a bit like a toddy shop, a kind of shop selling locally made sudar, maybe locally made sudar being sort of a generic word, but often also being sort of a thing made from grains. And so you can imagine, like, just within communities that drank, there'd be like, oh well, the ruling local family, they're sort of drinking indoors in private, and they're drinking maybe this imported wine. And I'm talking like sort of maybe the first millennium here. And then, there'd been, a sort of almost open to the public bar on the street where people were drinking sort of kind of a sort of watery beer type thing made out of locally grown grains. So you have these sort of social economic differences like that. And then, but then of course, and this is maybe what comes to mind for mostly is there were quite a lot of communities who abstained from drinking. Yet again, exactly how this worked in practice is hard to know because we've got these rather idealistic texts or moralizing texts. So exactly what went on, is hard to establish. But the theory, the kind of theory of how things ought to be, or in an ideal world, according to some people, how things ought to be, is certain groups abstained completely. So you'd have, say, Brahmins would completely abstain from all of these different things, that affected your head badly. Buddhists and Jains, similarly, was supposed to completely abstain. And then you actually have this sort of interesting thing that kind of comes up in Manu, sort of the Manava Dharma Shastra, which is quite well-known sort of text. A text like Manu, it's not like a set of laws of like, oh, this is the laws of land. It's kind of it's like a legal theoretical text, partly, in many ways. But in Manu, it's interesting. Brahmins can't have anything. So any of these drinks that have been sort of fermented and mess with your head. And but then the Kshatriyas and Vaishyas, they just can't have the fermented drink that messes with your head, as it were, made from grains and things like rice and wheat and barley. They can't have that, but they are allowed. And this is a bit of sort of difficult vocabulary involved. But they are allowed ones made from maybe honey, wine, grain wine, and sugarcane, and they are like that, which is kind of an interesting. It's sort of, to me, that really sort of displays very clearly this. What I emphasised at the beginning is that the drinks were actually considered to be really quite different drinks. Like you think nowadays you ban alcohol, like alcohol's alcohol, but like that's not how they thought of it. And so certain groups, like say, according to Manu, ideally, say Kshatriya shouldn't be having any of this say vice here, but they are allowed things like sugarcane wine and things like that. And like I said, there were a lot of choices around. And then there are references as well to somewhat to regional difference as well. So say Kashmir is associated with grape production in many of our texts, and wine production as well. So you have that kind of image as well. So yeah, so we don't really know exactly what was going on. Actual social history, but sort of certainly for the ideals, there's a lot of drinks, and there is theoretical sort of complexity. Sometimes it's economic, to do with sort of things being rare and important and prestigious, and then sometimes there's this abstinence, and the abstinence is complex. But I think I probably had my time, so I'll stop here and have a sip of coffee since early in the morning. I need to wake up desperately. Talking of intoxicating drinks, and I'll pass it on to Dr. Wald.
Thank you, sir, for the insightful observations. Now I'd like to request Dr. Erica Wald to share her insights on the topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Thanks. I think there's a lot of overlaps in terms of the spectrum of drinks available widely. So my work really picks up in the 18th and 19th century, and looks at the ways in which colonialism shaped drinking practices and cultures in India in the 19th century. So in particular, I look at the ways in which, so I'm coming to this from the background of being a military historian. So I look at the ways in which the anxieties around the military led to new restrictions more broadly on, not just in military spaces, but more broadly across society, on what should be drunk and by whom. So again, not simply in the military cantonments, but in civil space as well. So the drinking that elicited the most controversy for military board officials and government officials in the colonial state was the drinking practices of the so-called lower classes. And here they were most interested in the European soldiers, but also later in the 19th century in Indian laborers as well. So domestic servants or laborers in mill hands in Bombay mills, for example. And so there's this understanding that it's the lower classes are really unable to regulate themselves when it comes to drinking. They're not drinking the appropriate, the right drinks for their constitutions, essentially. And there are drinks that are assigned, that are seen to be associated with particular constitutions. So I look at the way, and I'll expand on that in a minute, I think. So I look at the ways in which military law and civil law, largely in the form of taxation, combine to shape these new drinking cultures. So, and I also mentioned that particular drinks were assigned racial and class characteristics. So all of this is linked to this lingering belief in the relationship between bodies and climate. And this guided European East India Company policy for on alcohol for much of the 19th century. And, we see this sort of ghosts of these beliefs lingering on even into the 20th century. So the idea here was that if you take a European body and you transport it to India, that European bodies will suffer from a certain sluggishness in India's climate. And that's not simply the sluggishness that, I think we all feel when it's 40 degrees. It's internal, right? So it's this sort of sluggishness in the bloodstream. And what that required was some form of stimulant, and alcohol was seen as a stimulant. So the argument was that the upper class Europeans in particular, who drank moderately and drank particular drinks moderately in India, could maintain a healthy constitution and be able to stay long term. Of course, that's the aim of colonialism and conquest, and that this moderate drinking of particular drinks was essential. So the drinks that are acceptable to these upper class bodies are things like Madeira, port, champagne, and claret. All these sort of imported European style drinks. And so again, moderate consumption is understood to be healthy and almost essential. The problem drinkers they identified were those who were the lower classes, who they argued were unable to moderate themselves, unable to regulate their drinking, and they drank inappropriate drinks. So what we see is really greater scrutiny placed on the drinks that are favored by the so-called lower classes. So whereas champagne is regulated through import duties, it really escapes the scrutiny that's placed on locally produced drinks. So if we go to those set of drinks, the working class soldier was seen to be particularly susceptible to excessive consumption of inappropriate drinks. And that was the problem, right? So the argument was that European soldiers should be drinking healthy drinks like rum and beer, but instead they were sort of falling back on or moving towards drinks like arak and toddy. And the argument was also that toddy was healthy for Indian bodies, but not for European bodies, right? So that's the sort of racial classification coming in there. So the discourse that I'm interested in examining is this argument that the colonial state is making that the lower classes simply didn't know how to regulate their drinking and by extension themselves, so the state had to do it for them. So I mentioned there's this sort of spectrum of drinks that were produced at the time, from the barely alcoholic, very fresh toddy, things like Mira, all the way through distilled spirits. Toddy was really hugely popular with European soldiers. It was because it was cheap, it was easy to produce. Toddy was, at the time, often sort of produced and drunk ultra locally. So, it would be sold not too far from the trees that was tapped. Drinks like arak, Mchugh, and daru were the so-called country spirits that might be found in grog shops in and around cantonments. Critically, for the colonial state, these drinks often evaded the revenue machinery of the colonial state. So they were sort of targeted for greater regulation. So, this regulation comes in the form of taxation, and increased taxation on country spirits, but also surveillance networks being established to look for evidence of smuggling. So all of this is if all of this is centered around military anxieties, how do the civil laws and taxes come in? They come in the form of the abkari, and the abkari was the revenue, the tax on intoxicants, both alcohol and drugs, or what we would identify as drugs today. The abkari had existed under the Mughals, under the Marathas, and the East India Company state takes on the abkari in 1780. So shortly after the award of the Diwani, they really quickly move to see how valuable this is for the colonial state. Lord Cornwallis declared that it was that immoderate drinking was the result of the low cost of the manufacture and sale of alcoholic drinks, and therefore, to prevent crime, the East India Company had to step in and implement the abkari and take over the control of taxation. So the East India Company very quickly moved to extend the tax to toddy, to drinks such as toddy, which previously had either not been taxed or had very, very minimal taxes applied. And this happened in 1800, and they expanded outward from there. So there was regulations in 1813 to establish government-run distilleries in large towns, and this essentially gave the state monopoly control over the production and sale of alcohol. And this increased taxation on country spirits had the impact of moving drinkers essentially out of the fields, out of the local spaces, into licensed liquor shops. So it started to change what people drank as the taxes on country spirits brought their prices up on par with European style distilled liquors. But it also made drinking and drinkers more visible as they moved into these shops. And so it became a further target, not just for the colonial state, but later for temperance campaigners, for nationalists alike. So by the 1870s, and I also see that I'm running out of time, so I'll stop after this, you see an increasing critique of the abkari, of the state control of alcohol by both early nationalists and temperance campaigners.
Thank you, ma'am, for your invaluable perspectives. That was really fascinating. Now we move on to the question and answer session. My first question is to Dr. James. So in your book, you have talked about the ambiguity surrounding the translation of the word for surah. Is it like a beer, wine, or rum? Which word would be the best fit according to you?
That's it. Well, in a way, I mean, surah, it almost means everything. So, I mean, on one level, it's sort of a very generic word for typically a liquid a liquid that has been transformed somehow over time and does stuff to your head. You know what I mean? Like makes you like your mind, makes you kind of confused, and so on and so forth. So it's something we'd call alcoholic today. And so that's sort of rather generic sense. And it's not even just drinks. I mean, like I've got a later tantric text which may even be talking about tobacco as a type of surah, and pan as a type of surah. That's doing that for rather complicated ritual tantric reasons. But I mean, basically anything that can potentially sort of mess with your mind could get lumped as a type of surah. But typically, In the very early periods, Surah would be a grain drink, like so in the Vedic period, sort of in some kind of Rig Veda or like slightly later Vedic texts. It's something made out of grains. Then Manu in this law, this Manavadharma Shastras, the laws of Manu, a well-known text. Manu sort of defines Surah very famously as there's three types of Surah, and one is made from ground grains, one is made from maybe honey or maybe wine or maybe both, and one is made from jaggery, so sugarcane, basically. And that's a kind of very famous definition. So, at its most narrow meaning, it would be a sort of grain thing in the Vedas. But then, in some ways, you can think of it as sort of liquor in general. Probably not distilled, I don't think. And this is, one of these competitions. I don't think it was distilled until maybe about 1200 much. So, yeah. So, it means everything, means sort of everything and anything. Very flexible word.
Thank you for answering that, sir. My next question is to Dr. Erica. You already mentioned about the military regulations surrounding providing sound liquor to European soldiers to shield them from dangerous country spirits. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, how the natives came to be viewed as a dangerous country spirits?
Yeah, so I think it's important to stress that the military regulations sought to regulate the drinks. They didn't seek to stop the men from drinking. So instead, I argue that it's quite the reverse. That you see all of these structures established within the military and within military space, actually to facilitate drinking. So you have, first of all, you have the commissariat, so the exclusive control of the sale of liquor and drugs around cantonments rested with the commissariat general. The commissariat was also responsible for buying alcohol to serve to the troops. And it's the commissariat that has all of these really interesting experiments with the local distilleries that are set up, but also with brewing beer. And it's the commissariat that establishes these relationships with particular London brewers who really design or designate a specific beer that would be exported to India to serve to the troops. And that's the origin of what we call India Pale Ale today. So I mentioned also that the commissariat is responsible for buying in this liquor for the troops. That liquor was served to them in two ways. So first was all of the European troops had a liquor ration. So well into throughout the whole of the 19th century, every soldier had a ration of 2 drams daily. And so a dram is quite a healthy shot, about 35 milliliters, quite generous. The first dram was served with breakfast, and the second was usually served around 4 p.m. And the timing was always debated, right? And that had to do with this argument about what alcohol did to your constitution and how it could help. So it was given in the morning to stimulate your constitution, essentially. So this was given, as I said, in the form of either spirits or beer. And liquor rations also increased when the men were on the march. Again, for climate reasons, if they were going to serve, for example, in the first Anglo-Burma War, many of the men argued that they needed more alcohol in order to survive the climate of Burma. And the second way that alcohol was served to the men was actually sold in addition to their liquor ration in the canteen. And men could gather in the canteens in the daytime and the evening to drink and talk. For most of the 19th century, the canteen was the only communal place, apart from barracks, that that they could gather, that was actually well lit, that was allowed within cantonments.
Thank you, ma'am, for answering that. My next question is to Dr. James. So, in chapter 4 of your book, you talked about spectacle and erotic drinking in ancient Indian literary texts. Would you like to tell us a little about that?
Yeah. Again, it's all materials I deal with, far more than Dr. Wald. They're really very artificial. I mean, you really got to imagine they're very literary. They're full of literary conventions. So you'll have the same kind of conventions, sort of, bouncing around for several centuries. And so it's kind of hard to sort of see how they sort of glues onto reality. Everything I say has to be sort of taken with that. If you're not terribly familiar with the sort of world of Sanskrit texts, it's very, there's a lot of literary conventions, which is great, but it means it's hard to sort of sift through. But yeah, so one, there's two, well, there's various types of evidence we have. There's things like legal texts, but in terms of like representing people drinking, there's two sort of big types of source. One is sort of religious text, like Buddhist text, sort of talking about sort of roguish people in a bar, sort of drinking, getting into bad things. These sort of moral texts like that. And then another main sort of type of representation, sort of genre, as it were, is the depictions of sort of more upper class drinking, maybe in private, maybe with servants, perhaps with this imported wine, and that is very much in that context. Drink is seen as sort of actually kind of essential, really. So long as you're allowed to drink, it's seen as really quite important for sort of erotic acts to sort of help people lose their inhibitions. And so on and so forth. So there is this kind of quite close connection in those. And so if you actually have a sort of poetic scene, the sort of erotic scene, often there will be drink involved, because it was, say in the Kama Sutra, it's seen as an important sort of prelude to sex, and then sort of after sex people have drinks again. And so you'll kind of get this in poetic erotic depictions. Not always, but quite often. So there is that connection, and that's sort of often seen as sort of rather delightful and beautiful. It's very, it's very different sort of discourse to the oh, look at those rogues down the bar, like drinking and about to get up to something naughty. So yeah.
Thank you, sir. My next question is to Dr. Erica. So you already talked about the shift in drinking habits of the natives at the colonial period. Did it result in any consequences?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess so. Again, the needs of the military really dictated colonial policy for much of the 19th century. Majority of Europeans serving in India were military personnel, and it was always made clear that without the military, colonial control would be threatened. So often regulations regarding alcohol, as I've suggested, were certainly first brought in by the military, but then these laws were just sort of replicated in civil law, and certainly the military often pushed this civil authorities to use the abkari to make it less appealing for European soldiers to drink country spirits through this, raising taxes and increasing regulations on how drinks were produced. So, but actually, I think it's important also to say that a lot of these regulations, both military and civil, were resisted. Not least by traditional producers and consumers of alcoholic drinks. So if I give one example, in Bombay in 1878, the new Abkari Act was introduced in 1878, and this new act set a fixed tax on date, brab, and coconut trees, between 3 and 14 rupees a tree, depending on where the trees were located, depending on the type of tree it was. It also, and this is quite critical, established a minimum number of trees that was allowed to be tapped, and that number was set at 50. And so what this automatically did, or what this law would have done, is really disenfranchise the traditional toddy tappers of the area, the Bandaris, who very vocally argued that they had long been allowed, this was, you know, their traditional area and their traditional groves that they were allowed to grow and tap, but also that they would usually on average, you know, tap between 3 and 5 trees, so much smaller than this massive number of 50. So what that number of 50 did was really prioritize large, wealthy producers over the Bandaris. It also set a monopoly grant on buying and drawing of toddy to a liquor contractor. So the Bandari were really priced out of the market with this. And what we see is a protest launched almost immediately from Bandaris, but also we see Adivasis joining in and arguing that the consumption of fresh toddy was integral to their existence, that it was important sort of nutritionally, not just in times of famine, but that it provided a number of nutrients that they really depended on. So in this case, the government was temporarily, at least, forced to pull back on implementing this, because essentially you have this widespread protest of people essentially saying that they're just not going to comply with this government regulation.
Thank you, ma'am. That was my final question. So with that, we come to an end to tonight's discussion. I thank both our panelists for sharing your knowledge and valuable insights with us. I'm sure our audience had a wonderful time and have learned a lot as well. We're grateful to you for taking out time from your busy schedules and for being a part of this discussion today. It was an absolute pleasure to be in company with you. This is to remind that we are calling for submissions on food and drinks, the details of which can be viewed on www.tmys.biz. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.